best essay I ever wrote for my English classes at Columbia University was a final paper arguing that Shakespeare's Twelfth Night was a proto-transgender text. At least, it was the best essay according to my English professor. I wrote the paper as a joke after that same professor had taken off points from my midterm exam when I failed to mention that A Midsummer Night's Dream was about queer desire. So I decided to humor her and write about how Twelfth Night was a play about transgenderism. And I got an A+ on a paper arguing that Twelfth Night is a proto-transgender play. It is no secret that English departments across the country have become absolutely ridiculous. But how did we get from the tradition of humanistic inquiry to Shakespeare is writing about transgenderism? I have many theories, so let's dive in. My name's Lisa, and you're watching Pens and Poison. So a few weeks ago, I walked you guys through my ridiculous journey in the Columbia English department that culminated in my decision to withdraw from academia. You can watch that video here, but today I'd like to give you guys a deep dive into not only what's happening in English departments, but why. To understand how we got to transgenderism and Shakespeare and decolonizing Jane Austen, we need to understand what the tradition of literary study has meant for thousands of years. Let's go back to our friends, the ancient Greeks, to find out. Now, the Greeks created a prototype for what we would think of today as the liberal arts education system. The Greeks pioneered an education system called the paideia, which prepared students for a rewarding life as citizens in the ancient Greek polis or city-state. Paideia was meant to instill aristocratic values in its citizens and create young men who were not only well-rounded but also refined in intellect and morals. Practically speaking, paideia included training in grammar, rhetoric, math, and science, as well as subjects meant to promote moral education, the study of music, poetry, philosophy, in other words, what we might think of as the humanities. The Greeks studied the humanities because they believed that these disciplines would help them become the best versions of themselves and the best citizens in their society. The educational ideals of the paideia soon seeped into the Roman world, where the word was rebranded and called, you guessed it, humanitas. This is where we get our idea of the study of the humanities. But the Latin word humanitas encompasses more than just the study of human nature. It also means culture, refinement, and civilization. In other words, our civilization developed the study of the humanities to understand human nature through the liberal arts. To be a good citizen and also to be a fuller human being was not just to be educated, but also to be cultured, because it is through culture that we can best answer the questions that help understand what makes us human. Now, this idea, as we know, very much seeped into our understanding of the humanities, and its biggest proponent was the poet Matthew Arnold in the 19th century. You probably know Matthew Arnold for his famous poem Dover Beach, but he also wrote a book called Culture and Anarchy, in which he argued in favor of the implementation of the liberal arts system on a broader scale. Arnold believed that the study of culture helped people become their best selves, and he defined culture through two terms, sweetness and light. Sweetness was Arnold's concept for beauty, and light was his concept for intellect, enlightenment, or morality. In other words, according to Arnold, the study of culture, or the study of the humanities, was about beauty and morality. Arnold believed that we could become our best selves by learning to appreciate beautiful things. Now, literature has always played a really large role in moral development. You see literary agents today being like, oh, I don't want morality stories, but that is like asking for a piece of music that doesn't use instruments. And unless you are John freaking Cage, that is not music at all. If you want literature without any sort of moral message, you might as well not read literature at that point. But that is what the academy and the publishing industry want you to believe today, even though literature has always been about moral education. That is the whole point of the humanities. We inherited a tradition from the Greeks and Romans where we use art to understand the world and ourselves. And this is also true cross-culturally, by the way. The idea of moral development is crucial for the idea of understanding literature. You see this in the works of Jane Austen, Leo Tolstoy, Fyodor Dostoevsky, just to name a few. And you cannot read literature without understanding some sort of lesson that is relevant to you today. In 1908, this idea was formalized by the new humanist literary scholar Irving Babbitt, who set out to redefine classic literature education in a collection of essays called Literature and the American College. Babbitt believed that the purpose of literature was to cultivate a long-lasting moral imagination. Literary study had a duty to craft readers into morally upstanding members of society. Of course, he borrowed a lot of these ideas from Matthew Arnold, and Babbitt's friend T.S. Eliot, my favorite poet of all time, later came in and insisted that literature was uniquely bound up with the idea of tradition. He talks about this in his famous essay, Tradition and the Individual Talent. We need to understand tradition not only to interpret existing literary texts, but also to create new ones. All of this is to say that literary study had been about tradition, beauty, and morality for literally thousands of years. Literature is supposed to teach us what gives our lives meaning. That is why we gravitate towards literature, because it tells us something becoming universal by way of the particular, which, by the way, is the mark of great literature. But by the 1960s, something had started to change. I don't want to pull a Jordan Peterson and insist that postmodernism is completely to blame, but it did play a very large role in shifting priorities in the literary academy. See, the postmodern intellectual movement in France, along with the rise of the neo-Marxist Frankfurt School in Germany, both sought to eradicate traditional morality-based interpretations of literature. The postmodern critic Roland Barthes, for instance, in his 1967 essay The Death of the Author, insisted that authorship and historical context were irrelevant to literary hermeneutics, a fancy word for interpretation. Barthes argued that a reader's personal interpretation of a given text should take precedence over its objective meaning. And as the literary world began to disengage with notions of authorial intention and interpretations that stayed true to a given text, we started to see a rise of moral relativism in the academy. But Barthes' ideas weren't just conceptualized in a vacuum. The advent of worldwide social reform in the 60s also opened the academy up for more progressive ideas amongst members of the New Left. When the Marxist thinker Herbert Marcuse joined the faculty at Columbia University, my alma mater, for instance, he brought his theory of repressive tolerance to the academy. Marcuse argued that traditional tolerance in society perpetuates repressive ideologies, and that true liberation can occur only when society becomes intolerant of hierarchies based on race, class, and gender. Sound familiar? Marcuse's ideas found fertile ground in the literary academy because no one else took him seriously, and as a result, scholars began questioning the notion that literature could be viewed outside of a socio-political context. As literary critics became more concerned with the text's relevance to marginalized communities, they began to emphasize the importance of identity and power dynamics over formalist traditional readings of literature. This marked a stark departure from the ideas of Babbitt and Eliot, who focused on beauty, morality, and tradition. Around the same time in France, the postmodern thinker Jacques Derrida came in and started to undermine everything we had ever known about literary study and about the Western tradition of the humanities. In his book of Grammatology, Derrida claimed that the tradition of Western metaphysics was repressive and that words held no objective meaning and were entirely open to interpretation. Derrida championed the idea of binary opposition theory, which purports that in the context of Western metaphysics, interactions between human beings have always been a series of black and white, good and evil, man and woman, light and dark, etc., and that one had always taken precedence over the other. Maybe this was well-intentioned, but you cannot argue that evil is the same thing as good. The moment you start making that argument, you start to lose sense of objective traditional morality, and that opens up a terrible can of worms. Derrida's colleague, Michel Foucault, later appropriated these ideas into the realm of gender, and all of a sudden, Twelfth Night became a play about transgenderism. So universities across the Western world had officially waged a full-scale war on tradition, culture, beauty, and society. We can sum up the effects of postmodern theory on the literary academy through three axioms of postmodernism. Number one, meaning is relative, if not entirely obsolete. This is Derrida's argument in Of Grammatology. Number two, authorial intention is irrelevant. This is Roland Barthes' argument in The Death of the Author. And number three, grand narratives are oppressive. There's another book called The Postmodern Condition by the French philosopher Jean-François Lyotard, where he argues that we must be skeptical of universal truths. What that means is that overarching moral systems are oppressive, and any notion of how to live well or how to lead a morally upstanding life is a no-no in Lyotard's book, because all of that is racist and oppressive and colonialist and patriarchal. You can see the effect of postmodernism on the literary academy, and now that we know the history of the liberal arts tradition, we can see just how much the study of literature has been perverted by postmodern thinkers and why literary study is such a mess in the 21st century. Today, the literary academy has become an intellectual playground for identity-based literary criticism, and all these supposed schools of theory in the literary academy seek to challenge the traditional notion that literature is supposed to make us into morally upstanding citizens and into better versions of ourselves. But the issue isn't just that these ideas have seeped into the literary academy. Maybe on their own, they would have been fine alongside the notion that literature does say something about tradition and can teach us something about our own lives. But the problem is that these ideas of truth, morality, beauty, and culture have been supplanted by radical ideologies. If you try to argue that literature is about culture and beauty, you are told that you are racist and narrow-minded and that literature has always been a political project. I know, because I get told this every single freaking day on the internet. But the greater problem is that this narrow-minded approach to literature risks obscuring some of the broader themes that literature has always brought to the table. The universal themes that literature can and should address. The questions that make us human. Humanistic inquiry. These questions have been sidelined in favor of a socio-political agenda. At its core, literature should explore the complexities of the human experience and help make us into morally upstanding citizens of our societies. Some of those questions are political, sure, but others have nothing to do with politics. Questions about ambition, love, death, suffering. Those aren't political questions. Those are questions at the core of who we are as human beings. And questions about race and gender and Marxism have traditionally had very little to do with literature. Until the public publishing industry took over fairly recently, that is. Literary study was once a place for deep intellectual engagement. It has now become an exercise in intellectual conformity, and literature itself has been reduced to a political vehicle rather than an amazing art form that teaches us something about what makes us human. Again, literature can engage with politics, and it often does, just ask George Orwell. But even Orwell himself acknowledged that politics was only one particular function of literature, and that there are so many other reasons that authors write literature. I'm sure that Orwell himself would have been horrified if he'd seen what we've done to literature today. There's this absurd insistence that every single work of literature must be read through the lens of race, gender, Marxism, colonialism, etc., etc. That is not what literature is about at all. Great literature transcends the political realm and speaks to what makes us uniquely human. English departments across the world have destroyed the study of literature, but we can make a difference by engaging in literature's more universal questions. We call this humanistic inquiry, and it's one of the most important ways that literature can make a difference in our own lives. At the end of the day, we as readers can return to these enduring truths about our shared humanity and restore literature to its rightful place in the humanistic tradition. That's how we can build a culture that can one day bring us together instead of tearing us apart. And I think we can do it. We revived the ancient Greek tradition once during the Renaissance, and we can do it again. We're living through a pretty dark cultural time today, but I think we can create a modern Renaissance and bring beauty, culture, art, and society back to literature where it's always belonged. Because you can put as many radical ideologies on literature as you want, but at its core, literature survives as the beautiful art project it's always been. And that's not going anywhere because of some radical English professors. Here on Pens and Poison, we are fighting the good fight against the radical Marxists in the academy, in the publishing industry, and elsewhere in the arts and culture world. So if this video resonated with you, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe, find me on Instagram where I talk more about these topics, check out my Substack where I talk about many of these topics in depth, and don't forget to join the fight in restoring literature back to its rightful place in the humanistic tradition. I'm Lisa with Pens and Poison, and I'll see you guys in the next video.